Hey everybody, my name is Kris Tomlinson. I'm with G.A.P. We are a services-based company that's been around since about 2005, so going on 20 years. And I'm going to talk about plant sap analysis. Waldo did a good job of explaining the importance of nutrient availability through your water sources and how that translates even into some of the soil. And so what we're going to talk about is plant sap analysis and how we can evaluate what's actually getting into the plant and how much the plant is being able to acquire, where those nutrients are being stored and how they're being stored, and ultimately what the plant is able to tell us about what it is wanting from a nutrient standpoint. So I'd like to thank the Wet Center for putting this on. Eco2Mix, Waldo, Carlson, thank you. So a little bit of background on G.A.P. Like I mentioned, we started in 2005. Originally, it was a request of our grower base to help them with providing services that require some expertise in helping them when they're making their decisions on the farm. So sampling is one of the backbone areas that we commonly deal with. We do all different types of sampling, from soil, tissue, water, obviously plant sap analysis, which was what we're going to talk about today, and anything and everything in there. So, soil samples, as you think about chemistry, also any disease or biological testing, pathogens, different things like that. Our sample technicians are trained and able to collect all of that data. We are not an analysis-based company. We're a services-based company, like I mentioned. So we partner with commercial accredited labs to actually do the analytical work, and then we work with the growers on the back end to interpret and make the decisions on how they can implement the information that's coming back on those samples. Some of the other things that we are involved in, as you can see here on the slides, is grant writing. We have a grant writer on staff, and her team work through different funding methods to get growers some of the money that's out there for different projects. Carbon credits, we're working in that space right now, helping with coordinating the information, not only gathering but also managing and making the decisions on some of the in-field cultural practices that come along with that. Product testing and field trials, we service as a third-party verification for some of the product efficacies and things like that, both for growers and manufacturers. We do obviously some agronomic consulting along with the sampling and some of the other processes, and the regulatory compliance. We've worked with many different agencies, either federally or state, that have certain permitting requirements for growers, all the way from some of the regulatory programs you've probably heard of irrigated lands and Sigma, to working with Fish and Game on different permits that they require of different growers. Kind of what I'm here to talk about today specifically is plant sap analysis. Most people have probably heard something about this if they're not already doing some type of work in this space. But in general, plant sap analysis is just another method that we can use to assess nutrients, the plant nutrient status. The difference between what we term plant sap analysis, or PSA, is what we abbreviate it sometimes, is we are only looking at the bioactive components that are in the actual phloem or xylem of the plant itself. So it is not structural components. So anything, if you think about from a nutritional standpoint, that would be a structural component that we typically are not getting in the SAP analysis because of the way that they are processed. And so with that, we also pull what we call pairs. So a SAP analysis is not a single leaf age. It's actually two different ages of leaf. And as you can see kind of here in the picture, your typical dry matter leaf analysis that most people are familiar with is that most recent fully expanded leaf. In the SAP world, that correlates to what is termed the young leaf. And then typically there's a second leaf that's pulled in that pear, which is termed the old leaf, and that leaf is somewhere between 3 to 5 positions back from the young leaf, typically on the same growing point. So we're really trying to get an evaluation of both the current status of the nutrition, and then what is going on in that old leaf from a sap sample, and based on that we can make some determinations, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So one of the things that is significantly different in the way that saps are pulled is the timing and the amount of sample that's required. So typically we're getting about 140 grams of each individual age leaf, both the young and the old. And those have to be collected before it gets too hot out. So that threshold is somewhere in the 85 to 90 degree range. And so as you can imagine, in the Central Valley, in the heat of the summer, that requires that these samples are pulled pretty early in the morning. Some days we actually are unable to pull them because we don't get it below the threshold. And so from a logistics standpoint, that's something that's really difficult and severely limits the ability to pull a large amount of samples in a single day. Our sample techs are typically getting started about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, and they're pulling, up until they hit that threshold, depending on where they're at. So once the samples are collected, similar to a dry leaf matter sample, you want to keep them somewhat cool. You don't want them to be sitting on the dashboard of your truck. So we typically are keeping them in a mobile refrigerated unit while they're in the field, and then obviously keep maintaining that temperature all the way through the process, all the way to the lab actually. And currently, we have a relationship with 4 different labs that are actually analyzing the SAP analysis, and they range from being, here in California all the way to the Netherlands. So from that standpoint, logistics can also be somewhat of a process, in that you're dealing with shipping times, you're dealing with, in some cases, international laws and regulations and things like that. So typically what we suggest, or what we see, is that the results are returned fairly rapidly, usually within 3 to 5 days of the lab receiving the results. So depending on what that ship time is, that obviously adds into that. So what do you get when you get a SAP analysis? And what are the things that we were talking about? I mentioned a little bit earlier from a mobility standpoint. So um, in the world of mobility, sometimes Waldo had kind of mentioned it. There's a soil mobility from the standpoint of nutrition, but there's also a plant mobility. And so what we're talking about with plant sap analysis is the mobility of the plant, or the ability of the nutrient to move in the phloem up and down the vascular tissue to where the plant is requiring that nutrient at that specific period of time. And so there's a little bit of debate on some of these. Most of these are pretty well set in stone, but for the most part, most of us have seen some version of this picture on the right here. But your immobile nutrients are typically, deficiencies are first seen on the younger tissue. And then as you get into the mobile nutrients, they are able to remobilize that nutrient. And so as the plant demands more of that nutrient in the younger tissue that's rapidly growing, it's able to remobilize that. So that's there's sometimes a little bit of miscommunication in what we're talking about when we're talking about the mobility, but we're specifically talking about mobility within the plant to move those nutrients, whether it is able to or not able to move those nutrients in the phloem based on plant demand. So anybody that's been involved in SAP is familiar with the picture here on the left. The bar graphs are what the lab usually sends back with the analysis of the different analytes. And then you've got two different bars for each nutrient because obviously you have a young and an old. And then based on the individual nutrient, they typically give a general range of high, medium, low, that type of thing, based on their historic understanding of the analytes, the specific analyte itself, and the crop. What so this one on the left with the green, the dark and light green bars represents one sample. What we'll often do is put it into what we call our snapshot, which allows us to evaluate more than one sample at one time. It has the empirical numbers there, similar to what the is provided on the lab analysis, but then we take it and also provide a percentage difference between the old and the new, and that's really where we start getting into the plant mobility and the ability of the plant to utilize that nutrition where it's needed and when it's needed. So, for instance, and here on this on the snapshot side there, the blue headers on the different nutrients are what we would typically call a mobile nutrient, and the orange headers are what we would typically term an immobile nutrient. And I mentioned this a little bit before, back to this. So you have your mobile and your immobile, and there's actually degrees of mobility within the mobile and the immobile. It really starts getting into the nitty gritty there. Boron is one of those, is very commodity dependent, whether it's actually flow mobile or not. So we typically put that one in as an asterisk by itself. And then there's some other ones that are the research is a little bit cloudy on some of the even micronutrients of moly and nickel and cobalt and things of those. And so those ones are a little bit more case by case basis as we get into the different commodities. But in general, these are kind of the standards of what the mobility of the different nutrients is. So we've seen the last slide. This was what we call the snapshot, or just a point in time. So this would be a single sample that's pulled and analyzing against itself, right? So we're analyzing young and old with that percentage there to try and get a better understanding of how the plant is acquiring and utilizing the nutrients that it is demanding, and what the potential supply of that nutrient is at that specific time. And so to take it one step further, the next step is we look at a single nutrient over a period of time. So in this case, we're looking at over about 6 months here. What we're seeing is that specifically this is nitrogen. And so as an example of kind of the power of SAP, is what we've done here is these are two blocks planted across the dirt road from each other. And what happened was these two blocks were on some experimental trellising types. And so with that comes a bunch of different variables that from an agronomic standpoint are a little bit touchy to deal with, just because you're dealing with densities and growing plants growing in an unnatural state. And so some of the nutrient demands are a little bit of a swag, if you put it. And so what we did here is we just took saps, and then these trees were planted. And then as soon as we were able to get enough leaf on them, we started pulling samples monthly. And so what we can see here is on the top one, what's labeled block one, our nitrogen demand is actually being met fairly well. If you see the percentage differences at each one of these points over the months is almost single digits. We got one that's a little bit higher than single digits here, but actually you can see based on the green coloring, that's actually the demand is actually being met above what the plant is requiring. A slightly different story as we get into block three. So block three, you can see the first couple months as we were getting growing, really not a huge difference in the total quantity or the difference between the young and the old sample. But as we started to get into July and then all the way through August or October, excuse me, we're starting to see that demand is not being met. And in this case, because this is a mobile nutrient, the younger leaf is outpacing the demand of the older leaf and actually pulling the older leaf, the actual the empirical value of the older leaf is below the younger leaf. And so what we see there is a demand that's not being met. And interestingly enough, we did pull standard regular dry matter leaf samples on this in the standard October timing. This is citrus, and less than a 5% difference in the actual nitrogen that was pulled in the dry matter leaf sample in October. However, looking at this, we see that we're starting to actually get a larger demand in one of the blocks versus the other. And so as this being a trial or an experiment into looking at different types of trellising, we were able to evaluate and realize that we were actually underfeeding one of these blocks, and we're probably not going to be able to get the benefit of the full opportunity of the different types of trellising if we weren't evaluating them. So we've looked at single nutrients. That last slide was more about single nutrients, and then one of the other real powers of SAP is looking at the nutrient interactions. So a lot of people are probably familiar with Mulder's chart. That's the circle with all the crazy lines in there, affectionately called the spinning wheel of death sometimes. But it's a lot of information to dissect. But basically, what's that saying is how do the nutrients interact with each other, and which nutrients are antagonistic to each other, and which ones actually can potentially stimulate the uptake of others. And so this is kind of a real backbone of what SAP is able to do from the standpoint of allowing us to really look at the interactions of what the plant is demanding and what potentially is could be limiting that uptake. This is another example of that we were pulled out of some of the data that we have. So in these are four different nutrients. We've got phosphorus with 3 of our micronutrients, and it's fairly well established in the literature that phosphorus and micronutrients are antagonistic to each other. Again, as we're talking about plant mobility. And so as we can see here, as we started early season in April, we had luxurious amounts of phosphorus. That's the third one down here with the green green color here. And at the same time, our micronutrient numbers are all deficient, or demand is not being met. And so working with this grower, what we recommended was, hey, you know what, normally you would be going in and doing some phosphorus. So this is table grapes. They would typically be going in August and September and doing some phosphorus applications to help with berry quality or fruit quality. And what we recommended was, hey, why don't we take the money that was in the budget for that phosphorus and let's actually add some micronutrients, because our micronutrients are being negatively impacted by our phosphorus, and we really don't need any more phosphorus because we're way above the demand of the plant. And so by doing that, we were able to bring these micronutrient levels up as we got into August and September, more into the demand period or the demand range of what the plant was actually looking for. Okay, advantages of PSA. We went over some of this a little bit. Early nutrient detection. We often can say that at a minimum, we can pick up with SAPs, we can pick up deficiencies at least 10 to 14 days prior to visually being able to see it. And actually, that's a lot of times a lot longer runway. Optimizing for fertilizer costs and application timings, improved quality, and then the better management of the ecosystem itself as we're getting into sustainability and some of those things. Well, a couple of, just to kind of wrap it up here, a couple of different things that we've seen from a real world standpoint of where we've been able to utilize SAPs to help make better decisions faster. From a fertility management system, some of you are probably familiar with the terminology of hidden hunger. That's where the demand is not being met, but it's not within the threshold of actually physically showing a deficiency. That can be as much as 20 to 25% sometimes. And so you think that the plant is getting enough nutrition, but it's actually deficient. It's just not physically showing that deficiency yet. Um, Plant demand drives the fertility decisions on the farm. So we have customers that we work with that run their whole fertility based on what's going on in their saps. Obviously, we have a baseline budget and things that we're planning to do, but all of those decisions in season are subject to what the results are coming back from their sap sampling. It also helps us with seasonal variability when we get cold, wet springs, super hot summers like we had here in the valley last year, and then also some product validation. So, hey, growers are always wanting to try new things. Hey, what am I getting for this? How can I evaluate whether this product's actually doing what it says to for me in my situation and in my operation? Obviously, introduction into new cropping systems. We've got new genetics. We've done many projects with growers where they have new genetics coming out. Some of those genetics can be having a wild card or an unknown in them, and how they're going to be, what their nutritional status is necessary. That falls right into scion and rootstock combinations, planting densities. I kind of mentioned something about that before, and cultural practices. As we are getting guys that are doing different cultural practices based on some of the regulatory requirements, some of the demands from management. Hey, we've got to do things a little bit differently. How can we make sure that we're addressing the nutrient demands of the plant while introducing some of these new practices? And then from a regulatory and a reporting standpoint, we've got a fair amount of customers that have off-farm ownership, is what we call it, and so a requirement to validate the expenses that you're incurring. And so this allows us to go to that management or that ownership and say, hey, these are the reasons we're making these decisions, and this is why. Obviously, from a nitrogen management plan, any of the regulatory stuff, and sustainability. I've used that word loosely because there's a lot of different people that are using but in that general realm of, hey, being good stewardships of the land, being good stewardships of the resources that we have, and providing that. Um, I'm running over time, so I'm going to skip those graphs there, and then just kind of a shameless plug for CalGap, but in a general broader stance, it's important, I think, to make sure that you're engaging with experts and doing and working with people that have the grower's best interest in mind. We mentioned our sample handbook. We have an internal sample handbook that we update regularly with new sample types and things like that. We have over 150 pages in that, and each one of our guys that's been with us, average of 5 years or more for our sample techs, are trained on that every year. And so the critical component of anything that comes to data is making sure that the validity of the data is there. And so we pride ourselves, and there's other people that do this as well, pride themselves on making sure that the samples are pulled correctly and managed correctly. There's nothing worse than bad data. Making good decisions on bad data still ends up being a bad decision. And so we really pride ourselves on that, and we see it as an important part of the service that we can provide to our customers to make sure that we're getting them the highest quality data that's possible so that they can make the right decisions. With that, I'll say thank you. I know we're over time. I apologize. Any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I'll stay on and answer them on here. Or if we don't get to them all, I'm sure we can get them get me an email, and I'll respond to them.
Thank you so much, Kris. That's super interesting. I learned a lot about sap analysis. We have a couple questions. So what lab you work with, and then with those 4 different labs, how do you pick which lab the sample ends up going to?
Yeah, so we work with 4 labs. Like I mentioned, there's one lab in California that we're working with, a lab that we're working with in Oregon, Michigan, and then there's a lab in the Netherlands that we work with. And so what we often tell growers is every lab is a little bit different in that the way that they process and they report the results. We're agnostic from that standpoint. We'll deliver them to wherever the grower wants. So we typically will look at the individual labs and the analytes that they offer. Some of them do offer different types of analytes, and kind of get an idea of what makes the most sense for the grower. And then once a grower has started utilizing a lab, we typically like to try and keep them at that lab, just because some of those variabilities in the way that the samples are processed do come back with different numbers. And so as we're looking at a historical or a timeline of the different nutrients, we just want that consistency to be there, and making sure that the procedures within the lab are not affecting the way that the samples are coming back. Those samples are typically fairly consistent. We actually do some blind testing or double samples to send them off to different labs, just to get a feel for, hey, X lab may report potassium a little bit higher, but it's consistently higher, or hey, why this other lab over here, typically gets a little bit lower nitrogen number. Okay, that's fine, as long as we understand what we're doing. And a lot of that comes into the way that we're managing the data on the back end, because what I didn't get to show on one of the last slides there is some of the historical stuff that we're utilizing to help us make better decisions. And so as we're collecting this data, over the last 15 years we've been doing SAPs now, we're in a position where we can start really looking at these demand curves and how these nutrients are being utilized by the plants specific to growing conditions, here in California, and the commodities that we're working with.
Awesome. Do you pay attention to optimal levels, or only the difference between new and old?
We do both. And so that's kind of what I was talking about. There are labs that will come back with optimal levels, and nothing against the labs. The labs do a very good job, but and I hate to so I always preface this by saying I don't want to be that guy, but this is California, and California, we do things differently. There's a reason that we grow over 400 different crops in California. And an almond sample from Australia is different than an almond sample here, or a citrus sample from Morocco or Brazil is different than a citrus sample here. And so we do keep an eye on those optimum ranges, and that's part of what we're doing is looking at our data set, and we're starting to actually implement our own. We're not calling them optimum ranges, because that denotes something that is definitely not. But what we're calling them is kind of our standard ranges that we see or would expect for commodities and samples pulled here, because we do see some significant differences between the ranges that we see and the optimum levels that the labs purport sometimes. And it's not always, but there is some differences. And so we take that into account, but we also very heavily look at the demand curves that we're building based on the data that we have, and the comparison of the samples themselves.
Another question: is sampling always recommended to be monthly? Do you do beginning and end of the season? How do you
Good question.
handle
Good
frequency?
question. Yeah, so we do a lot of monthly sampling on the commodities that we deal with quite heavily, a lot of the permanent crops that we deal with here in the Central Valley. With that being said, we do sample at different intervals for some crops. Early season crops, we will go all the way down to a 2-week sample period, as we're really gaining. Like right now, we're in the middle of blueberries and stone fruit, and including cherries and nectarines, peaches, all that stuff. We go as tight as a 2-week sample. And I know that we've done some stuff in the past on a little bit of stuff over, or we've been a part of a project on the coast where they were doing every 2-week samples as well. On I think that was one of the projects was strawberries. And so it's really about the appetite for the data. There's a lot of data that comes back here, And so a lot of times what we tell our guys too is as well as, hey, let's not do every field or just replace this with your standard dry matter leaf sample or whatever you've been doing. Let's pick a few representative locations and pull more samples more in a tighter window and really help us build those demand curves and what the plants are already doing rather than going out and pulling larger acreages and providing or introducing more factors for variability. And so really a lot of the guys that we deal with on the SAPs, we're not even pulling every field. It's really more of a representative of, hey, what does this field represent in my operation? And they're actually still, most of them are on a standard dry matter leaf sample regime because that's kind of your report card, right? So we think of a lot of times as a SAP sample as kind of our progress report. Like we're getting our progress reports through periodically throughout the growing season, and then we get our report card at the end of the year with our dry matter leaf sample. It allows us to delineate between the two of, hey, what was our nutrient status at different times of the year? And then also, where did we end up at the end of the year or at the end of the growing season? And so, but it also gives us the idea, how did we get there, right? The standard is, hey, if you put all your nitrogen on early season, but that's when the plant demands it, and your dry matter leaf sample is low at the end of the year, okay, well, does that mean you put more nitrogen on at the beginning of the year, or do you put more nitrogen on in the middle of the year just so that you can get that nitrogen number up? But at that point in time, that may not be going into fruiting wood or may not be going into fruit quality. And so that may just simply be, hey, I want to get this number to X because that's what the dry matter leaf sample says it should be. But at the same time, I've doubled my pruning bill, or I've started shading out fruiting positions for the future. And so those are the kind of the things that we use both, and everything's a tool, right? It's I like to say we don't have hammers, because if you have hammers, everything looks like a nail. We like to have, wrenches and screwdrivers and the whole tool belt, because not every tool is going to fit the situation.
You take SAP analysis on annuals or only on perennials and trees?
We are heavily based on perennials, us personally, but we do some work on annuals. It's not the biggest part of our portfolio, but we do some on annuals, and annuals can be a real valuable SAP can be real valuable in annuals because things are moving so fast a lot of times in those. So I would encourage, again, anybody to get involved with SAP, and not saying you need to use us, but there's plenty of other people out there doing SAP. Use it and use it as an exploration into some of the things that you may be able to look at your operation and get a better understanding of some of the things that are going on.
And what area do you serve with G.A.P? What's your range?
We're based out of the Central Valley. Tulare, California is our home base, but we run all the way down to Coachella, all the way up to the Sac Valley and over to the coast as needed. We do have kind of standing work over there on kind of a monthly basis, so that we try and group some of those areas that are outside of our standard home territory, so that we're getting as much done at one time. So we're not opposed, and we have experience going outside of just the San Joaquin Valley, but that definitely is kind of our home base.
Awesome. Just a couple of seconds for any other questions or comments.
I have a comment, if I can, may, talking about the previous question you answered regarding the labs. One of the things that it was important for us was being consistent on the data. So we only been using for our soil sampling since 21 until today the same lab and the same analysis, like B crop and Haney, always the same. So I made the mistake sometimes to send second sample to different labs to check, especially in the nutrition side, the fertility analysis, and the results were so different that there is no way to compare one with the other. So I have history and data for more than 4 years now with the same lab and the same analysis. So I can compare one with the other. What is the changes? Because if I start jumping around different labs because I don't like what you do, say what here or there, it's impossible to compare for me. In my case, soy samples. So I want to add that to the presentation. So it's important to be consistent. When you find what you're looking for, stay and keep doing exactly the same, because as you said, one lab is going to give you different levels of potassium, or it's the same sample and it's the same material, but that means the machine or the whatever is calibrated differently. The people that is doing the samples read different the results. So I prefer to have one that I can compare one with the other. It doesn't matter if it's the correct one or not, but I'm having always the same methodology. Even for each ranch, we know exactly what plant and what row and what plant we took all the soil samples, and it's been always the same since 21. That was it, like what I want to add to a little bit this one.
Thanks. Any final thoughts from you, Kris?
No, thank you for the opportunity. Thanks to the Wet Center, and thanks Waldo and Carlson for putting this on.